this legal hotline video, I want to talk to you about some issues that can arise when you're using the seller's disclosure of property condition form. Now, quite often you may have been involved in a transaction or transactions that involved a bank, for example. And when trying to get them to fill out the seller's disclosure of property condition form, they've told you they're not going to do it, that they have their own form. Or in the alternative, they're going to say something like, okay, here it is, and then what they send you is the form with a line drawn down each portion of the questions that are answered. And then to top it off, they will actually sign indicating that they have actually completed the form. Well, obviously they have not completed the form. And the real question becomes, what do you do in this situation? Well, first we're going to look at the statute. KRS 324360 states that any sale involving single-family residential real estate dwellings must use the seller disclosure of property condition form if a licensed agent receives compensation as part of the transaction. So essentially, if you're in the transaction acting as an agent and there's money being paid to you or to the buyer's agent, then this form needs to be filled out. Now, there is some options when it arises that the seller does not want to fill out the form or does not want to complete the form in its entirety. And let's talk about those. First, if you'll notice in the form, there's some preliminary things that need to be filled out. The property address, when they owned it, the time period, and again, the property address. And that needs to be filled out no matter what. Now, if the seller indicates to you that they're just going to draw a line through this and then sign it as if they filled that out, you should not give this form to the buyer in that condition because it has not been completed. And the statute requires, the KRS statute requires, if the seller refuses to complete and sign the form, his refusal shall be communicated in writing by the broker or sales associate who is involved in the transaction to the purchaser or prospective purchaser without unreasonable delay. Now, what does that mean? That means that you've got to notify the buyer that the seller has refused or has failed to complete the form. So the form that they send to you with the line drawn through it, well, they haven't answered all the questions, so that's a failure to complete the form. That means you should not give them the incomplete form that's been filled out by the seller. What you should do instead is fill out this portion or have the seller fill out this portion. The part that you're looking at where it says the first option is the seller refuses to complete this form and acknowledges that the real estate agent shall so inform the buyer. That's great. If the seller's willing to sign that, you can do it and move right on. Now, the other option, if the seller says, I'm not going to sign anything other than that I completed it, even though I didn't complete it, then what you really need to do is the last option. And that states that the seller has refused to complete this form and has refused to acknowledge his failure to complete this form. That's what should be submitted to the buyer, because that should then cue the buyer that maybe I shouldn't be looking at this transaction, or I should be looking at this transaction more closely and should engage more experts or inspectors or what have you to make sure that they have an informed opinion with regard to completing the transaction. So that's what you need to do if your seller refuses to sign or fails to complete the form. Now, one other thing that the seller may tell you, the seller may say, and again, this could be a bank or a company that brings in a lot of different properties, the seller may tell you that we have our own form that we use. Well, that's all well and good to have your own form, but that doesn't replace the form that's required by the state. And I liken it to this situation. If a policeman pulls me over for speeding because I'm going faster than the state required 55 miles an hour, I can't look at him and say, oh, well, I appreciate the state's requirement, but I have my own speed limit. That wouldn't be acceptable on the road, and it's not acceptable in your real estate transaction.